It wasn't on the royal calendar. No announcement. No briefing. Yet behind closed doors in Whitehall, Prince William was already seated alone before members of the Privy Council. No king present. No approval given. And when word quietly reached King Charles III, insiders say the silence inside Buckingham Palace turned chilling. Because this wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the whispers were dismissed as procedural noise, the kind of quiet administrative reshuffling that rarely escapes the tightly controlled machinery of the monarchy. Reports suggest that aides initially believed it to be a routine consultation, something technical, something forgettable. But that explanation did not hold for long, because as more fragments began to surface, it became clear that this was no ordinary engagement. This was a meeting held in isolation, attended solely by the heir, with no visible oversight from the sovereign himself. And within the rigid framework of royal protocol, that absence was deafening. Insiders whisper that several senior aides were caught completely off guard, their carefully synchronized schedules suddenly out of alignment with reality. The palace, usually so precise in its coordination, appeared momentarily fractured. Communications slowed, clarifications were avoided, and those who asked questions were met with silence that felt less like uncertainty and more like containment. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of palace administration that early attempts were made to downplay the significance of the meeting, framing it as procedural, even routine. But the tone shifted quickly, because the more they tried to minimize it, the more it drew attention. Those familiar with the monarchy's inner workings understand that the Privy Council is not a casual forum. It is a body steeped in centuries of authority, a mechanism through which the sovereign exercises some of the most critical functions of state. And for Prince William to appear there alone without prior clearance, without visible endorsement, was not just unusual. It was a deviation from a system built on continuity and control. Various interpretations of this moment describe it as either a necessary adaptation to evolving circumstances or a bold, calculated move that crossed an invisible line. But even among those offering more charitable readings, one truth remained unavoidable. This was not standard practice. Media insiders claimed that something had felt off for weeks leading up to this moment. Small inconsistencies, subtle shifts in tone, a growing sense that decisions were being made faster than they were being communicated. And now, with this revelation, those scattered observations began to align into a more unsettling pattern. Because this meeting did not emerge from nowhere, it was the visible peak of something that had been building quietly beneath the surface. Palace administrative streams, ranging from internal scheduling discrepancies to carefully worded public statements, hinted at an institution under pressure. Not collapsing, not even visibly unstable, but strained. And within that strain, roles that were once clearly defined began to blur. The heir was no longer simply preparing, he was acting. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, carried profound implications. Because in the monarchy, timing is everything. Authority is not just held, it is observed, respected, and reinforced through ritual and order. And when that order appears to shift, even slightly, it sends ripples far beyond the palace walls. Why now? Why step into such a space without the formal presence of the king? Was it necessity, or was it something more deliberate? The answers, if they exist, were not offered. Instead, what remained was a growing tension and unspoken recognition that something significant had just occurred. Not loudly, not publicly, but unmistakably. And as those whispers continued to spread, one realization became impossible to ignore. This moment was not just about a single meeting. It was about what that meeting represented. But this wasn't just a scheduling anomaly, it hinted at a shift in power already underway behind palace walls. For months, the monarchy had been operating under strain. King Charles III, weakened, distracted, and increasingly absent from key state functions, had quietly ceded more responsibility than the public realized. But what no one expected was how quickly that vacuum would be filled, and by whom. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a shift in the air that only those closest to it could feel. Reports suggest that the king's schedule, once dense with engagements and ceremonial obligations, had been quietly thinned, leaving noticeable gaps that were explained away as routine adjustments. But within the palace, those gaps carried weight. They represented decisions not being made, appearances not being fulfilled, and authority not being exercised in the way it once had been. And in an institution built on presence as much as power, absence is never neutral, it creates space. That space, insiders whisper, did not remain empty for long. Prince William, long prepared for a role he had always been expected to inherit, began stepping in with a decisiveness that some found reassuring and others found deeply unsettling. What was initially framed as support, temporary, respectful, necessary, soon evolved into something more consistent, more visible, and perhaps more permanent than anyone had openly acknowledged. Different interpretations of this transition describe it either as a natural progression under extraordinary circumstances or as an acceleration that risked outpacing the traditional rhythm of the monarchy. But regardless of perspective, the effect was undeniable. The balance was shifting. Within palace corridors, concerns about continuity of leadership began to surface in quiet, carefully worded conversations. Not public concerns, not even formal discussions, but subtle acknowledgments that the system might need to adapt faster than it was designed to. Those familiar with the institution's inner workings understood the gravity of such thoughts. The monarchy does not move quickly. It does not improvise. It relies on structure, precedent, and the slow, deliberate transfer of responsibility. And yet, here it was, facing a situation where time itself seemed to be pressing against those traditions. Some insiders, according to whispers circulating among royal commentators, believed that this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. Historical precedent, rarely spoken of openly, hovered in the background, quiet. Reminders of past reigns where illness or incapacity forced difficult adjustments. The concept of regency, though never formally invoked, lingered as an unspoken possibility. Not as a declaration, but as a shadow. And in that shadow, decisions were being made, roles were being redefined, and expectations were quietly recalibrated. But not everyone agreed on how or when this transition should unfold. Palace insiders were reportedly divided, their perspectives shaped by loyalty, caution, and differing interpretations of duty. Some argued that stability required immediate action, that the institution must continue to function without hesitation, regardless of personal circumstances. Others believed that any visible shift in authority risked undermining the very foundation it sought to protect. This tension did not erupt into conflict, at least not openly. Instead, it simmered beneath the surface, influencing decisions in ways that were rarely acknowledged but deeply felt. And as these internal dynamics unfolded, a more subtle realization began to take hold. What had been presented as temporary an adjustment, a precaution, a momentary redistribution of responsibility was beginning to feel less temporary with each passing week. The lines between support and succession blurred, not through a single dramatic act, but through a series of small, cumulative steps. Each decision, each appearance, each assumption of duty added another layer to a transformation that few had anticipated but many were now witnessing. The public, for the most part, remained unaware of the full extent of these changes. Official statements remained measured, reassuring, carefully constructed to maintain a sense of continuity. But behind those statements, the reality was more complex. Authority was not being transferred in a single moment, it was being absorbed, gradually, almost organically, until the distinction between the king's role and the heir's involvement became increasingly difficult to define. And within that ambiguity, a question began to take shape, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing development. If the heir was already performing the functions of the sovereign, then what exactly remained unchanged? The answer was not clear. Perhaps it was not meant to be. Because in the monarchy, clarity can be as destabilizing as uncertainty. And so, the system continued to operate outwardly intact, while internally adjusting to a reality that few were willing to fully articulate. And while the king believed control remained intact, William was already stepping into spaces once considered untouchable. What was discussed in that room has never been officially released. But fragments, briefings, off-record whispers, and carefully worded denials paint a far more calculated picture. Because this wasn't just a meeting, it was a message. At first, the absence of clarity seemed deliberate, almost strategic. Palace communications, usually precise and measured, became unusually vague, offering just enough information to acknowledge the event without explaining its purpose. Reports suggest that internal briefings were tightly controlled, their language carefully constructed to avoid confirming or denying anything of substance. But in the world of royal governance, silence rarely exists without meaning. It invites interpretation. And in this case, it sparked a wave of speculation that refused to settle. Insiders whisper that the discussions may have centered on constitutional continuity, an issue that, while rarely spoken of publicly, sits at the very core of the monarchy's stability. The question of how authority is maintained during periods of uncertainty is not theoretical. It is embedded in centuries of precedent, shaped by moments when the crown itself faced vulnerability. Various interpretations of the meeting suggest that contingency planning may have been a central focus, not as a declaration of crisis, but as a precaution against it. Emergency protocols, long established but seldom invoked, were reportedly part of the conversation, raising the stakes far beyond what a routine consultation would require. Those familiar with the Privy Council's inner workings understand that its role is not merely advisory, it is foundational. It operates as a bridge between tradition and governance, ensuring that the machinery of state continues to function even when circumstances become unpredictable. And within that context, the presence of Prince William alone carried a weight that could not be ignored. Some accounts describe senior council members engaging with him not simply as the heir, but as a figure already stepping into a more active, authoritative role. This shift, subtle yet significant, blurred the line between preparation and execution. The absence of King Charles III, meanwhile, became a focal point of interpretation. It was not just noted, it was analyzed, questioned, and, in some circles, seen as symbolic. Why was the sovereign not present in a discussion of such importance? Was it a matter of necessity, or a signal of something deeper? Palace administrative streams offered no clear answers, and that ambiguity only intensified the speculation. Because in an institution where presence is often as meaningful as action, absence can speak volumes. Media insiders, drawing on weeks of subtle inconsistencies and shifting narratives, began connecting the dots between the timing of the meeting and the king's ongoing condition. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of royal commentary that this was not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern, one that had been quietly unfolding beneath the surface. The meeting, in this interpretation, was not the beginning of a change, but a visible confirmation of one already in progress. Different interpretations of this moment continue to compete, each offering its own explanation, its own rationale. Some frame it as a necessary adaptation to ensure stability, a responsible step taken in the face of uncertainty. Others see it as a calculated move, a demonstration of readiness that may have arrived sooner than expected. But regardless of perspective, one detail remains consistent across all accounts. The meeting was significant, and its implications extend far beyond the walls in which it took place. As these fragments of information circulate, they create a narrative that feels both incomplete and revealing at the same time. Each piece adds to the picture, but none provide a definitive answer, and perhaps that is by design. Because in the monarchy, certainty can be destabilizing, while ambiguity allows for control. It keeps the institution flexible, adaptable, able to respond without committing to a single interpretation. But it also leaves room for doubt, for speculation, for questions that linger longer than they should. And among those questions, one has begun to rise above the rest, not loudly, but persistently, echoing through every new revelation and every carefully avoided answer. Because if this meeting was indeed a message, then it demands to be understood. Not just in terms of what was said, but in terms of what it signaled. But as details slowly surfaced, one question began echoing louder than the rest: was William preparing for something far bigger? It didn't come from an official briefing. It came as a whisper filtered through aides, stripped of detail, but heavy with implication. And when King Charles III finally understood what had happened, insiders suggest the reaction was not anger, but something far colder. At first, the information arrived incomplete, almost hesitant, as though even those delivering it were unsure how much should be said aloud. Reports suggest that the message passed through several layers of the palace before reaching the king, each retelling slightly more cautious than the last. Not because the facts were unclear, but because their meaning was difficult to contain. A private meeting, no prior notice. The heir present alone before the Privy Council. And with each piece of that reality settling into place, the weight of it became impossible to ignore. Those familiar with the internal rhythms of Buckingham Palace describe a moment of stillness following the revelation, a pause that felt less like confusion and more like calculation. Because this was not simply unexpected, it was disruptive. The monarchy operates on coordination, on the careful alignment of authority and appearance. And here, that alignment had fractured, if only briefly, in a way that could not be easily dismissed. The king, long accustomed to maintaining control through presence and precision, was now faced with a situation that had unfolded beyond his immediate awareness. And that alone carried an emotional charge far deeper than any public reaction could reveal. Insiders whisper that the response was measured, controlled, almost deliberately restrained. There was no immediate confrontation, no visible display of frustration. Instead, there was something quieter, something more complex. A recognition, perhaps, that the situation was not as simple as defiance or misunderstanding. Because within the palace, the line between necessity and overreach is rarely clear, and in this case, it was blurred almost beyond recognition. Was this a moment of initiative taken in the interest of continuity? Or was it a step taken too far, too soon, without the consent of the one still holding the crown? The inner circle, according to various interpretations, reacted with a mix of shock and unease. Senior aides, many of whom had spent years navigating the delicate balance of royal protocol, found themselves confronting a development that did not fit neatly into any established framework. Some reportedly questioned how such a meeting could occur without broader awareness, while others focused less on the breach itself and more on what it signaled. Because the act was significant, but the implication was far greater. Even Queen Camilla, along with key advisors, was said to have been caught off guard, their own understanding of the situation evolving in real time. Palace administrative streams, often so tightly coordinated, appeared momentarily out of sync, as though the system itself was adjusting to a reality it had not fully anticipated. And within that adjustment, subtle shifts began to emerge, small changes in tone, in communication, in the way decisions were framed and conveyed. Questions quickly followed, not always spoken aloud, but present nonetheless. Had Prince William acted independently, driven by a sense of urgency that outweighed protocol? Or had there been quiet support behind the scenes, a network of approval that never reached the king directly? Those familiar with the duchy's operational culture suggest that such actions rarely occur in complete isolation, yet no clear answer has been offered. And perhaps that ambiguity is what makes the moment so unsettling. Because without clarity, interpretation fills the space, and interpretation, in a system like this, can reshape reality. As the immediate shock began to settle, what remained was a subtle but undeniable shift in the palace dynamic. Nothing overt, no declarations, but a change nonetheless. Authority, once clearly centered, now felt slightly diffused, its boundaries less defined than before. The king remained the sovereign, his position unchanged in title and tradition. And yet, the perception of control of who was actively shaping the direction of the institution had begun to evolve. And within that evolution, a deeper tension took hold. Not visible to the public, not even fully acknowledged within the palace, but present in the spaces between decisions, in the pauses between statements, in the quiet recalibration of roles that followed. Because this was not just about what had happened, it was about what it revealed. About the fragility of structure when tested by circumstance, and the speed at which balance can shift when that structure is no longer absolute. Because this wasn't just about a meeting, it was about control, and who truly held it now. In royal history, power rarely moves in sudden leaps, it shifts quietly, almost invisibly, until one moment makes it undeniable. And for many watching closely, that moment had just arrived. What had once appeared as a temporary adjustment now carried the unmistakable weight of permanence. Reports suggest that Prince William was no longer simply assisting, he was operating with a level of authority that, while not formally declared, was increasingly difficult to ignore. The distinction between heir and acting force had begun to blur, not through a single announcement, but through a series of decisions that accumulated into something far more consequential. And within the palace, those who understood the subtleties of power could feel the shift long before it was ever acknowledged publicly. Insiders whisper that institutional alignment had already begun to take shape, quietly and without ceremony. Senior figures, bound by duty to the continuity of the crown, appeared to be adjusting their expectations in real time. This was not rebellion, it was adaptation. The monarchy, by its very nature, does not allow itself to stall. It moves forward even when circumstances threaten to slow it down. And in this moment, that forward motion seemed to be gravitating toward William with a quiet but unmistakable force. The role of the Privy Council became central to this perception. It is not merely an advisory body, it is a signal, a mechanism through which legitimacy is reinforced and authority is quietly recognized. For William to stand within that space alone, engaging with its members as though the transition had already begun, carried implications that extended far beyond the meeting itself. Those familiar with the Council's historical weight understand that its interactions are rarely accidental. They reflect alignment. And alignment, in this context, suggests something far more deliberate than coincidence. Yet beyond the palace walls, the public narrative remained largely unchanged. Official statements continued to emphasize continuity, stability, and unity. To the outside world, the monarchy appeared intact, its structure unshaken, its leadership steady. But inside, according to various interpretations, the reality was more complex. There was a growing divide between what was seen and what was understood, a gap between symbolic leadership and functional control that widened with each passing development. Historical comparisons began to surface, not as direct parallels, but as quiet references to moments when the crown had faced similar pressures. Those familiar with past transitions recall periods where authority shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, before eventually becoming undeniable. But even within those precedents, the current situation felt distinct, because this was not a formal transfer, not a declared regency, not a moment defined by clear lines. It was something more fluid, more ambiguous, unfolding in real time without a single point of acknowledgement. And that ambiguity carried its own kind of tension. Because when power shifts without declaration, it creates uncertainty not just about who leads, but about how decisions are made and who ultimately holds responsibility. Some insiders suggest that this uncertainty is intentional, a way to maintain stability while allowing necessary adjustments to occur. Others view it as a risk, a fragile balancing act that could tip if pushed too far. But regardless of interpretation, the effect is the same. A monarchy operating in two realities at once, one visible, one understood only by those within its inner circle. As this duality deepens, the contrast becomes harder to ignore. On one side, a king whose role remains unchanged in title and tradition. On the other, an heir whose actions increasingly define the direction of the institution. Neither reality cancels the other. Instead, they exist together, creating a dynamic that is both stable and unsettled at the same time. And within that dynamic, the question of timing becomes critical. Because transitions, when they come, are meant to be clear, decisive, and recognized. This one, however, seems to be happening in fragments, each piece adding to a larger picture that no one has fully confirmed. But if this was the beginning of a new order, it raised an even more unsettling question. Was the transition already irreversible? No denial, no confirmation, just silence carefully measured, strategically maintained. Because sometimes in the monarchy, what isn't said carries far more weight than what is. In the hours that followed the revelation, the response from Buckingham Palace did not come in the form of clarity. Instead, it came in carefully constructed statements that acknowledged nothing while appearing to address everything. Reports suggest that official communications were deliberately shaped to preserve stability, their language neutral, almost detached, as though the event itself did not warrant deeper explanation. But within that restraint, there was intention. Because silence in this context was not absence, it was strategy. Insiders whisper that senior aides moved quickly behind the scenes, not to confront the situation directly, but to manage its perception. The priority was not to explain what had happened, but to ensure that its implications did not spiral beyond control. Media narratives, according to various interpretations, were subtly redirected. Their focus shifted toward broader themes of continuity and resilience, rather than the specifics of the meeting itself. It was a familiar approach, one rooted in the monarchy's long-standing ability to shape its own story without appearing to do so. Yet even within this controlled environment, tension began to surface. Royal commentators, often aligned in their understanding of palace dynamics, found themselves divided. Some argued that the lack of response was appropriate, even necessary, framing the situation as an internal matter that required discretion above all else. Others viewed the silence as a sign of something more concerning, a reluctance to address a development that could not be easily justified within the boundaries of established protocol. And in that division, the narrative became more complex, more difficult to contain. The absence of direct acknowledgement regarding any breach of protocol only deepened the uncertainty. There was no admission, no clarification, no attempt to define the event within the framework of tradition. Instead, it remained suspended in ambiguity, its meaning left open to interpretation. Those familiar with the monarchy's communication strategies suggest that this approach is not accidental. By avoiding specifics, the institution retains flexibility, allowing it to adapt its position as circumstances evolve. But that flexibility comes at a cost. It creates space for speculation, for doubt, for questions that linger without resolution. Meanwhile, the public, observing from a distance, was left to navigate a narrative that felt incomplete. Official reassurances offered stability, but they did not provide understanding. And in the absence of understanding, curiosity grows. Why was there no clear response? Why did the palace choose silence over explanation? These questions, though rarely answered, became part of the story themselves, shaping perception in ways that no statement could fully control. Palace administrative streams, operating beneath the surface, continued their work with precision, ensuring that outward appearances remained consistent. Engagements proceeded, statements were issued, the structure held. But within that structure, something had shifted subtly, quietly, but unmistakably. The silence did not erase the event, it framed it, giving it a weight that words might have diminished. Because when an institution built on tradition chooses not to speak, it is often because what it cannot say carries more significance than what it can. And so, the narrative remained suspended between what was known and what was implied, between official calm and underlying tension. Each passing day without clarification added another layer to the story, reinforcing the sense that this was not a moment that would simply fade. It was something to be managed, to be absorbed, to be understood only in fragments. And as the silence stretched on, the meaning behind it became impossible to ignore. For centuries, the role of the heir has been defined by patience, waiting, observing, preparing. But in rare moments, history forces a different path, and William may have just taken it. There is a quiet discipline that has always shaped those born into the line of succession. The understanding that power will come, but not yet. That responsibility exists, but must remain restrained. That presence must be felt, but never exceed its place. For generations, heirs have lived within that delicate balance, learning the weight of the crown without ever touching it. But what happens when that balance is disrupted? When waiting is no longer an option, and preparation begins to resemble action? Reports suggest that Prince William has gradually moved beyond the traditional boundaries of the heir's role, not through declaration, but through decision. His approach, according to various interpretations, reflects a leadership style that is more decisive, more immediate, and less bound by the slow rhythms that once defined royal transition. This is not simply a matter of personality, it is a response to circumstance. A moment where the demands of continuity may have outweighed the expectations of patience. And within that shift, something fundamental begins to change. Insiders whisper that this evolution has not gone unnoticed within the palace. Some view it as a necessary adaptation, a form of modernization that ensures the institution remains stable even under pressure. They argue that the monarchy must evolve, that it cannot afford to remain static when faced with challenges that require swift and confident action. From this perspective, William's choices are not disruptive, they are protective. They represent a willingness to step forward when the situation demands it, even if that step appears to challenge tradition. But others see it differently. For them, this moment carries a sense of unease, a feeling that the line between readiness and overreach may have been crossed. Because the monarchy is not just an institution of governance, it is an institution of symbolism, where timing and order carry as much weight as action itself. To move too quickly, to assume too much before the moment is formally granted, risks unsettling the very structure it seeks to preserve. And within that tension, the question becomes not just what is being done, but whether it is being done at the right time. The implications of this shift extend far beyond the present moment. They reach into the future of the monarchy itself, shaping how authority is understood, how it is transferred, and how it is exercised. If the heir can step into operational control before the crown is formally passed, then the nature of succession begins to change. It becomes less ceremonial, less defined by a single moment, and more fluid and ongoing process rather than a clear transition. And while that fluidity may offer stability in times of uncertainty, it also introduces a level of ambiguity that the monarchy has traditionally avoided. Those familiar with the institution's history understand that such moments are rare, but not without precedent. There have been times when heirs have taken on greater responsibility, when circumstances have demanded a more active role. But even within those examples, the current situation feels distinct. Because it is not marked by a single event or declaration, it is unfolding gradually, shaped by decisions that accumulate over time. And that gradual nature makes it harder to define, harder to measure, and ultimately harder to reverse. As this transformation continues, the contrast between tradition and adaptation becomes more pronounced. On one side, the enduring expectation that the heir waits, learns, and prepares. On the other, the emerging reality that waiting may no longer be enough. And within that contrast lies the true significance of this moment, not just as a departure from tradition, but as a redefinition of what the role itself can become. Because in stepping forward, William is not simply responding to circumstance, he is reshaping expectation. And whether that reshaping will be seen as necessary evolution or premature transformation remains uncertain. The monarchy, built on continuity, now finds itself navigating change in real time, its future being shaped not by a single decision, but by a series of actions that carry both promise and risk. But history will judge this moment not by intention, but by its consequences. In the end, the monarchy survives not on tradition alone, but on its ability to adapt in moments of crisis. And what happened behind those closed doors may define its future for decades to come. What began as a quiet, almost imperceptible shift has now taken on the weight of something far more consequential. The question is no longer whether change is happening, it is how that change will be understood. Reports suggest that within the palace, two interpretations continue to exist side by side, each shaping the narrative in its own way. For some, this moment represents crisis, a disruption of order that challenges the carefully maintained balance of authority. For others, it is strategic evolution, a necessary adjustment to circumstances that demand resilience over rigidity. And within that divide lies the true tension, not just in what has happened, but in how it will be remembered. At the center of it all stands King Charles III, a figure whose legacy now finds itself inseparably linked to the actions of his heir. His reign, already marked by complexity and challenge, is being reshaped in real time by events that extend beyond his direct control. This is not a story of displacement, but of transformation, one where authority is not lost, but redefined. Yet that redefinition carries emotional weight, because legacy within the monarchy is not measured only by what is preserved, but by how it evolves under pressure. And in this case, evolution has come faster, and perhaps more visibly than anyone anticipated. Alongside him, Prince William emerges not simply as the future, but as an active force within the present. His actions, whether viewed as necessary or premature, have already begun to shape the institution in ways that cannot be easily undone. The monarchy now stands at a crossroads between its past and its future, between the stability of tradition and the demands of adaptation. It is a position that requires balance, but balance is not always easy to maintain when the ground itself is shifting. Public perception, though slower to change, remains a critical factor in this unfolding narrative. Official statements continue to emphasize unity, continuity, and strength, presenting an image of stability that reassures even as questions linger beneath the surface. But perception is not static. It evolves, influenced by moments like this, moments that challenge expectations and invite deeper scrutiny. Trust, once established, must be maintained not just through words, but through clarity. And in the absence of that clarity, interpretation fills the space, shaping understanding in ways that cannot always be controlled. Within the palace, the consolidation of power appears to be happening quietly, almost invisibly. guided by necessity rather than declaration. There is no formal announcement, no singular moment that defines the transition. Instead, it unfolds through action, through decisions that accumulate until their combined effect becomes undeniable. This quiet consolidation stands in contrast to the outward appearance of unity, creating a dual reality where stability is both genuine and carefully maintained. It is a delicate balance, one that reflects the monarchy's ability to adapt while preserving the illusion of continuity. And perhaps that is the defining characteristic of this moment, not disruption, but transformation through subtlety. The institution does not fracture, it adjusts. It absorbs pressure, redistributes responsibility, and continues forward without openly acknowledging the changes taking place within it. This is how the monarchy has endured for centuries, not by resisting change, but by controlling how that change is perceived. And in this case, that control is being tested in ways that feel both unprecedented and strangely familiar. Because what happened behind those closed doors was never meant to be fully explained. It was meant to be understood gradually through its consequences, through the way authority is exercised, through the roles that evolve, and through the legacy that ultimately emerges from this moment. And as that legacy begins to take shape, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The future of the monarchy will not be defined by a single event, but by how it responds to the forces that challenge it. Because in the House of Windsor, power is never simply inherited, it is taken, tested, and ultimately proven in silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.